Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this YP broadcast featuring Senator Wilson and Representative Corry and WPC's own Jason Mercier of the Center for Government Reform. We're going to be talking today about Governor Inslee and his emergency powers and how we are going about trying to reform them. First of all, I'll just ask our three guests to please briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Jason and then the Senator and then the Representative.
Great, thanks, Marissa. I am Jason Mercier, the Government Reform Director for the Policy Center. I've been with WPC for about 14 years, but covering Olympia for 22, and am happily based out of the Tri-Cities.
And I am Senator Lynda Wilson. I represent the 17th Legislative District, which is down in Clark County and mostly unincorporated and part of Vancouver. And I'm ranking on Ways and Means and on the Business Financial Institutions Committee. And going on my 8th year. There we go.
Well, good to join you today. My name is Representative Chris Corry, proudly representing the 14th Legislative District. I live here in Yakima, Washington. My district covers Western Yakima County, all of Klickitat County, all of Skamania County, and a sliver of Clark. So a lot of territory, without question, the most beautiful district in the state. No offense, Senator. And I am assistant ranking on appropriations and also serve on consumer protection and business and community and economic development.
Fabulous. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And I realize in my haste to introduce the three of you, I forgot to introduce myself. So briefly, my name is Marissa Gaston. I am the Young Professionals Director at the Washington Policy Center, and very happy to be here with you all. So jumping into our topic at hand, emergency powers, Governor Inslee and reform. I'll first kick it over to my colleague, Jason, and he's been working on this just avidly for the past 689 days, almost 2 years. So Jason, if you could take just a few minutes and sketch out what's been going on. What is the situation here?
Thank you, Marissa. So yeah, for 2 years, we've had an interesting conversation in Washington about emergency powers. And basically what that means is if there is a crisis, and usually you're thinking about things like an earthquake, volcanic eruption, a flood, a bridge collapses, you want your executive, you want your governor to be able to quickly respond to that, because it takes the legislature time sometimes to assemble and to act. And that's why Washington and every other state in the country, the legislative branch temporarily delegates to the executive branch those emergency powers to quickly respond. Now, I said temporary delegate. That is true in most of the rest of the country, but is not in Washington state. And this has nothing to do with Governor Inslee. It has nothing to do with whether you agree or disagree with every decision he has made. It's just a statutory weakness with Washington's oversight or lack thereof for emergency powers. Because how it exists right now in Washington, there's two treatments. If the governor suspends a statute, if he suspends a law, that is only in effect for 30 days unless the legislature or legislative leadership reapproves it. However, any restrictive proclamation, think about things like closing businesses, telling you where and when you can go, the amount of people that can be in a certain place at a certain time, those type of orders receive zero legislative oversight and zero legislative permission, and can and do, as we've seen now for the past 2 years, continue indefinitely. That is not the case in most of the rest of the country. The rest of the country doesn't make that distinction between waiving law and restrictive orders on citizens. Everything in those states requires legislative oversight after a set amount of time. And I think what's been kind of disappointing up to this point, which we now have some better news to talk about here, but for all of last year, there didn't seem to be an appetite from legislative leadership, who are the same party as the governor, to protect that institutional role for the legislature. Because we're talking about roles of the branches of governments, not do you like a policy, is the policy popular, do you like the governor? That's truly irrelevant to this conversation. And in other states where you saw what we have as a Democratic trifecta, right? The governor and the House and the Senate are run by the same party. That's also true in New Mexico. That's also true in New York. Yet in those states last year, you saw legislators say, we have a very important role. We're the branch that creates policy, and our executive has too much power, and they fought to provide balance. That did not occur in Washington. That is changing, though, and thankfully we have with us sponsors of a couple of the bills, bipartisan bills. Representative Corry is sponsor of House Bill 1772, which would require that legislative oversight after 60 days. Senator Wilson is sponsor of Senate Bill 5039, oversight after 30 days. The bill that's up for a public hearing next Friday, January 28th at 10:30, and we have remote testimony. So I would encourage everybody who has interest to sign into this, because this is probably the only bill that's going to get a hearing and move this year. It's sponsored by Democratic leadership in the Senate. And while the policy isn't necessarily something that would change what we've experienced, it has a very broad bill title. And this may seem like getting into legislative weeds, but that means we can have a real debate, real amendments, and a real opportunity for reform.
Thank you. I'd love to turn it over to the senator and the representative, each briefly, to just speak to your bill and where it's at in the process, and give us just a little bit of background before we move deeper into the discussion, starting with Senator Wilson.
Well, thank you. So my bill is Senate Bill 5039. I pre-filed it in December of 2020. So that's how long I've been working the bill. And as Jason said, it's basically the same process that we're doing now. So 4 corners in order for any statutory proclamation, we have the ability to continue it if all 4 corners votes to continue. One of those saying no would not allow it to continue. And that bill is, well, and then my bill, what it does is it includes all of the proclamations, so the prohibitionary ones as well. So we would have a say through the 4 corners. And like I said, I've been working on that for over a year, and it's stuck. I mean, there's never been, we have begged for a hearing on that over the course of every year we've been in session. And then also asked to please have a special session to hear that bill, and that didn't occur either. Of course, you have to have 2/3 of the legislature to do that. Never been done in the history of the state. So that was, but we keep trying, and so that's what my bill does. And another one coming, by the way.
Yeah, and similar to Senator Wilson, I have House Bill 1772. There are some differences between the two. Really, it's not anything drastic, but I would say with mine, what we were looking for is a couple things. One, we wanted to give a timeline. So after a certain amount of days, the legislature needed to come in and say, yes, we agree, or no, we need to change course on any given emergency. And I think one of the things that struck me in some of the opening comments from your team here was the notion of reform. People keep thinking that this will end the current emergency. Well, that's not necessarily the case. We have unified Democrat governance in Washington state that would probably largely agree to continue doing these things, but at least they'd be on the record. And that's kind of what we want to put in statute, because it's not just today's emergency, it's whatever comes down the pipeline. So my bill would limit an emergency to 60 days unless extended by the legislature, which we think is more than fair. If the governor can come in on whatever the issue is and make their case, and we can say, yeah, we agree, you need this power to continue, or no, we're going to move in a different direction. The other piece I think is important is the aligning the current law, which says statutes have to be reauthorized every 30 days by the legislature or the 4 corners, to also include the prohibitionary items that Jason was talking about earlier. We need uniformity in those, and I think lining those two up make a lot of sense. And again, a lot of this is about allowing the citizens who are under these emergency orders to have a voice in their continued operation. And I think if the governor comes in and pitches and makes a good case for why they need to continue, they'll continue.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is perhaps driving Inslee's intent? I mean, is it hubris, a desire for control, a belief that his administration can kind of unilaterally navigate through these issues? I mean, there's a spokesperson for the governor, Mike Falk, who said that after everything we've gone through and continue to experience, there's no plausible reason to pass laws that would limit the tools we have to protect public health. That there seems to be an assumption there that the governor and his administration are the only ones who can successfully kind of navigate this crisis. how successful do you think we've been in the last 689 days?
Well, if I may, Senator, just because this was probably one of the most egregious things I think the governor said. And there's two parts I want to address. First of all, Mike's incorrect. We're not saying it's an on or off switch and we're ending his powers. What we're saying is that there's another independent branch of government that gets to come in and have a voice in how those are administered. It doesn't automatically end it. It doesn't automatically curtail it. Frankly, I think it expands it and makes it more inclusive. Second to that, you mentioned hubris, and I think the governor has really taken on this identity that he's the only one that can save lives. And actually, that's what he said in an interview with Austin Jenkins.
Right.
His direct comment was, "I'm the only one that can save lives in Washington State." And I think that's offensive to individual citizens who've been doing the right things every day to take care of themselves and their community. I think it's offensive to the hospitals and the nurses and doctors who are on the front lines of this pandemic. We are a intelligent society that can care for itself. And we agreed in the beginning, we didn't know what was coming down the pipeline. So we needed to have some government oversight while we weren't in session. But after 2 years, there's really more tools in the toolbox than I think the governor's press secretary is letting on.
And I was going to say the answer to that would be yes, to all the above, right? He thinks he's doing fine. He thinks he doesn't need us. We forget that I think there's some confusion here about checks and balances and what he should be doing, what we should be doing, right? The legislature passes laws and he interprets them. He's not supposed to be creating law, which is essentially what all these proclamations are doing. So he has indicated that he didn't need the legislature there, that he's just doing fine. So that is offensive to us as legislators because we have been elected by our constituents to represent them, to be their voice. So I think that our voice should be heard, and that's not happening. And quite frankly, in the bill that's being heard next week, it really doesn't allow for us to have any voice either. It has the four corners like we do, but there's no way to be doing any of this through concurrent resolution. So when we're in session, we would have no way of stopping the prohibitive proclamations or for ending the emergency. So, that it tells me a lot that that's the direction that they're going. It's only four corners. And if one votes no, so any one of them would be able to continue the emergency. That's not input. And we know that's probably the direction they would be going right now if that was in place.
And Marissa, very quickly, which Representative Corry alluded to, these bills don't end the emergency. They don't restrict anything the governor's done. They don't take any tools out of his toolbox. That's what elections are for, right? They don't like the policy, you can change the people in charge. These are governance bills. These are bills about, should there be a legislative branch of government that exercises its responsibilities, or do you have a benevolently elected monarch behind closed doors make all the decisions for the state of Washington? The arguments that the governor has made for this, why don't they apply to the education crisis, the homelessness crisis, his climate concerns, right? There's really no rationale for why you would allow one person behind closed doors to not include the legislative branch of government on this policy than on any other policy facing the state of Washington.
What would happen then if the existing governor's term ran out and his emergency powers were still in place? Would the governor transfer that power to the new governor, or would they potentially suspend elections?
So the question of the existing orders, if somehow, some way they're still in effect after 2024, they remain in effect currently until they are rescinded by the governor. That is a flaw of our existing statute. Whereas with the bills by Representative Corry and Senator Wilson, that's where you have an affirmative vote from the legislature after a set amount of time to continue. The governor can do what he wants for a set amount of time, and then he makes the case to the legislature about why it's the proper policy to continue. The bill up for public hearing next week, Senate Bill 5909, while a slight change from where we are right now, it's not an affirmative requirement. The powers and the orders remain in effect up until the legislature votes to end them, which realistically the legislature can do already.
Right. So it really isn't any meaningful reform. But like Jason said, there is a capability of us to have, when this bill hits the floor, to slap my bill on as a striking, right? So we will have that conversation. And that, I think, is what the governor is uncomfortable with, is that conversation that we're going to have.
Yeah,
And I really, go ahead.
I was just going to add, it's interesting, and in some of the conversations I've had with my Democrat colleagues is I've just, I've asked them repeatedly, at what point are you guys just okay with your entire role as a legislator being co-opted and moved to somebody else? I mean, and I know they're frustrated, right? And I understand that it's hard to go against the leader of your party, right? In this state, it's Governor Inslee. But at some point, they need to stand up and say, listen, we're an elected majority as well. We have a role to play here too. So I'm hopeful that, with these bill hearings and then these amendment process, we can actually get to a place where we as a legislature, it's not going to be everything that I would want, I'm sure, but we can say, yes, this is meaningful reform. And my goal would be to send over unanimous votes, unanimous ayes on this. That way the governor can't really veto it. And if he does, we're going to turn around and say, nope, sorry, this is going into law. So that's my goal through this whole process.
And that's a really excellent segue to my next question. And I'll note that I really appreciate the framing of these bills as governance bills and this as a governance question. But I mean, it seems clear, as Representative Corry just spoke to, that emergency powers reform, or addressing the issue of emergency powers, should be a bipartisan issue in Washington state. So I wonder what rationales for reform have resonated with legislators on both sides of the aisle, both Democrat and Republican.
They're not interested, so we haven't had much conversation. That's pretty much the whole story. That's why we haven't had any discussion at all in the last year. I don't know, Chris, you have a thought?
Yeah, I think they're coming around to it. They're not offering a ton of specifics yet, but I will say what's changed and what's interesting, it was, we did a push for some emergency powers reform in 2021, largely just cast aside, no, we're not going to deal with this. And then right after we got out of session, the governor rolled back Pierce County, and all of a sudden, a lot of the Pierce County Democrats were threatening to do something. And so I think they've been bitten now. It wasn't just, before it was a lot of Eastern Washington that was held back, my district included. And so they didn't feel necessarily like there was anything to do. But now they're starting to come to the table. Have they said, we want this, this, or this? No. But, they've been adamant that they've got to navigate how do we pass something that's reform that is gonna, not upset the governor too much. And my point at this point is, you're gonna upset the governor no matter what. Just get it right this first time, then we won't have to worry about it anymore.
And to Corey's point, we have had no table in the Senate. So the House is Democrats seem to be more apt to have the conversation, whereas the 5909 was dropped just quickly, and we didn't even know it was coming, and it was just dropped with no conversation with us.
Do any of the three of you have any sense of how emergency powers reform is polling across voters in Washington state? Is there a groundswell of interest in it?
Well, if you listen to, sorry, Jason.
Oh, go ahead, Senator.
I was just going to say, if you listen to what Emily Randall said when she dropped her bill, that she's had 1,000 emails in her inbox about doing something with emergency powers over the course of the last year. That has been a big topic in my district. And I've gotten a lot of emails saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? And we keep saying, we're trying. It's just that our voice has been limited. So it is, I don't know about polling specifically, maybe Jason knows about that, but I do know that there is a lot of interest.
Yeah, so I think the way, and this is why some of the frustration with how this debate is unfold, the polling on should the state of Washington be having a COVID response? Yes. The question is, well, are there other approaches that can be addressed? That's what's not happening right now. And that's why you have a legislative branch of government, because you have 147 minds versus one who can think of alternative ways. So let's say that the representative and the senator's bill have been in place since before the COVID crisis. Would we still have a vaccine mandate? Would we still have a max mandate? Probably. because the legislature is controlled by the same party as the governor. Would we have closed private construction but opened public construction? Would we have closed small businesses but opened big box businesses? Would we have been the only state to ban fishing? Probably not, because there's not a really way to make that kind of rationale for these arbitrary policies. That's where you would have a public process saying, this doesn't make sense, and there's other ways to address that. And that's really why you have a legislative branch of government to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. And, the one thing I'd like to say is, I haven't necessarily seen a poll. A lot of the empirical evidence I get shows that there's pretty wide support for some change. And I think the big piece is really the big piece of concern that I see from my business community and others is the uncertainty with how these things can just get swept in. I mean, anytime the governor has a press conference, I get texts from a variety of people. Okay, what am I losing now? What do I have to do now? Like, the fear over a governor's press conference it shows you just how far out of whack we are. I mean, these things should be debated in a public forum. Again, first 60 days, sure, yeah, you've got a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we're 2 years in, and our businesses and our people shouldn't have to sit around wondering if by stroke of a pen, with no public input, whether or not their whole lives are going to be uprooted again on a week-by-week basis. It's just not a good way to live your life.
And it's easy for us to get together. We've proven that, right? We can vote remotely. So it isn't that we can't get together and call for a special session and have this discussion, because we can't in a moment's notice. So no excuses there.
And these are such incredibly salient points. Again, framing it as a governance issue and emphasizing that we do indeed have a representative government, and that right now the voices of the legislative branch are effectively stifled, effectively neutralized. And so these bills, it may not even change immediately some of the policies that we're experiencing, since there is a majority party in control across all three branches, but nevertheless, it would restore some integrity to the nature and the form of our government. The question I'd like to conclude on for kind of the young professionals audience is, we're a group of people who really try to be engaged in policy and in our communities, and just engaged in the process. So one of our mantras is policy plus action. So I'd just like to pose to you, what maybe are some ways of what can young professional voters do to address these issues and allow their representatives to have a voice in government?
Well, clearly, because 5909 was dropped, there must have been some pressure there that she was feeling from her constituents if she had 1,000 and she felt she had to do something. So I would say just continue to testify on the bills. Jason does a great job on our behalf, because I was thinking I'd love to be over there in that committee to testify myself, but that's usually doesn't happen. But that's really, getting out there and sharing the word of what truly, that's going to be the issue here. I think with this bill here is that it's going to be difficult to explain to people that it really doesn't do anything, right? Instead of coming off as, oh, wow, now we have reform. Well, not really. So it'll be education. So I would say, that your young professionals would be great help there to expand and let everyone know what the bill actually does.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I'd also add, it's important to focus on the governance aspect of it. We've really highlighted that here. And I think that we probably don't do enough talking about that. It's good governance, it's government reform. It's not about stripping Inslee's powers, because we know the reality is that if tomorrow we held a vote on the House floor, the Democrats are going to side with almost everything he's done. And actually, some of them might change their vote a little bit because now they're on the record, right? Before it's always been, well, you can hide behind it. But focusing on the good governance aspect, that's key. That's a lot of what the work of Washington Policy Center is all about, right? It's not about the Republican way or the Democrat way. It's about what is good governance for the state. And clearly, we have a constitutional crisis here. We have emergency powers that aren't balanced. and we're an outlier, and we need to bring some balance in there. And that, you know what, it's funny, is it protects whoever is in the legislature for whoever is in the governor's mansion. You know, it may not always be a Democrat. If there's a Republican in there, it protects a legislature if they disagree with a Republican governor. So hopefully we can get past it's about Inslee and it's about this emergency and say, no, we've got a bigger issue that we need to look at for the generations ahead.
And Marissa, I think the most immediate thing is Senate Bill 5909 does have a public hearing January 28th at 10:30. And if you go to the legislative website, you'll figure out, or there's a way to provide that remote testimony. You have 3 things you can do. You can sign up to do the video testimony like we're doing right now. You can sign in just to say if you're for or against the bill, and you can provide written comments. And if they've got to hear that this is an issue. So if there's not a lot of interest or turnout in that hearing, it'll be easy to shelve this bill. If you have thousands of people expressing their viewpoint, it makes it a little bit harder for it not to move through the process. And I think the takeaway that I would give, and this is basically going to be my testimony, there is no logical reason to treat waiving of statute and how you treat restrictive proclamations. Whatever you do should be the same, and we don't need to overcomplicate things.
So the action item from our discussion here today is go testify next Friday on January 28th. Jason, Representative Corry, Senator Wilson, I want to thank you all so much again for taking time out of your morning to be here with us, and to wish you all a very wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend, and best of luck in the work that you're doing as the legislative session progresses. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.